Good morning. Thank you for attending today. This is our 5th webinar in our Reach Codes Newcomers series. My name is Misty Bruceri, and I'm the coordinator for the Utilities Reach Codes program. Today I am here with 5 speakers. Our co-hosts, Karen Christensen from Marin and Lawrence Garber from the Building Decarbonization Coalition, as well as Brian Reyes from Marin County, Joe McCluskey from Burlingame, and last but not least, Christian Hoffland from Santa Barbara. Each of our speakers today will be sharing their experiences and perspectives and hopes that that will help you leverage that information and better prepare for implementing your policies as you move forward. Next slide, Karen. Our agenda today, as always, is very full. We have a lot to discuss in a fairly short amount of time. I'm going to begin with a high-level review of some of our earlier sessions, and then I'm going to hand it over to Brian and Lawrence to provide some perspectives that they've gained as they have tried to analyze some of the impacts of Reach Codes and try to obtain some data about how Reach Codes have fared over the last code cycle. Following that, our local panel, which will be led by Karen, will share thoughts on their specific experiences in their jurisdictions, some of their lessons learned, and also some tips and tricks that they've learned as they've gone through their implementation process. And lastly, we'll wrap up with a review of some of the implementation resources that we have available now and in progress, and also have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. We do have breaks in the middle for Q&A. We don't just have the end time, but we will also reserve some time at the end. Before I begin, I want to let everybody know that we are recording the session today. So please be aware of that. Both the recording and the presentations will be available online, and we've got the links to those in slides later in the course, excuse me. A little bit more on logistics. If you have a question during the presentation, go ahead and raise your hand if you have kind of a short question, something that is a clarification. For example, one of us starts speaking in acronyms or things like that, and you just aren't sure, please raise your hand and we'll pause for those kind of quick questions throughout the presentation. However, if you have a more involved question or comment or things like that, if you put those in the chat, we'll pause periodically and address all of those as well. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So our intent today is to provide some background and technical information to you so that you can, to help you work on Reach Codes and understand the impacts and different considerations you need as you begin to get ready for implementing your Reach Code. Our intent is not to encourage any particular type of Reach Code. We don't intend to discuss how to advocate to get one adopted. We won't go into any technical calculations today or any details about specific items. We also won't be talking about how you can actually make a project comply with a Reach Code. Really, we're just talking about the process of adopting and implementing that code and getting ready for it at this time. Lastly, I do want to mention that none of us are lawyers, and the code landscape is changing very, very quickly right now. And so we do encourage you to talk with your city and or county attorneys whenever you're considering any new policy. Okay, and before we begin, we'd like to do a very short poll just to give us some idea of who's in the room with us. Karen just dropped a link in the chat. If you could go ahead and click on that link and answer, there's just 2 questions there. She's displaying the results now. We'd just like to get an idea of who's with us today and basically where you're from within the state, if you're in the state. Okay. Does everybody see the link okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm not seeing any responses yet.
You might need to refresh. I submitted mine already.
Okay, thank you. goes.
Not sure why it's so slow this time, but
Here's Google Drive is
the ways of the
having a
internet
slow
are
morning.
always a mystery.
Indeed.
Okay. Come on.
Well, this has worked 4 times in a row, and time number 5 apparently is not the charm.
Not the charm.
Okay, well,
we can, if it comes back, I will save it and we can hit it. Come back.
Okay. Apologies for that, folks. Thanks. It looks like several people are putting some of their information in the chat. I appreciate that. Okay, we will go back to that if I'll take a pause once we go through the next few slides, and then we'll go back and see if we have results. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and take over the screen here, Karen, if that's okay. All righty. Okay, so this is our 5th session. We've done 4 sessions prior to this, and so I'm just going to quickly look back at some of our previous sessions and do a very, very high-level review of the topics that we discussed during those sessions. In our first session, we started with the basic question of what is a REACH code? Well, a REACH code is actually an informal phrase that we use to refer to a bunch of different types of policies that require projects to exceed typically minimum state requirements. It's actually a local ordinance that, in the narrowest sense, amends the California Energy Code. But a REACH code may also amend other parts of the building code, such as advanced EV infrastructure requirements or water efficiency requirements that amend CalGreen or other parts of the code. In addition to that, there's some other policy tools available that are often referred to as REACH codes, but may also amend a municipal code, such as a health and safety code or another type of municipal code. But for our purposes today, we're going to focus on the traditional REACH code, which amends the California Building Energy Efficiency Standards, the state's minimum code. So the requirements for a REACH code, there's a whole bunch of nuances here, and there's nuances throughout all of these. And we have a webinar on each one of these slides, so I'm not going to go into them here. I'm just going to quickly cover this. For a REACH code, the first 3 requirements are actually required if you amend any part of the building code. It has to be at least as restrictive as the state code. You have to include findings that the REACH code is indeed needed for local climatic, geological, topographical, or environmental reasons. And you can't specifically require equipment that exceeds the federal minimum efficiency standards. The federal government regulates many different appliances, and state and local governments are not allowed to specifically require that equipment exceed those minimum standards. For an amendment to the Energy Code, it also has to be cost effective, and it has to go through the CEC approval process and ultimately be filed with the BSC, the Building Standards Commission. All amendments to the building code have to be filed with the Building Standards Commission. Okay. All righty, so in our second session, we talked about the adoption process and how an ordinance typically originates from a goal and a cap or another action plan, becomes a proposal based on technical feasibility and feedback through the local outreach and stakeholder engagement process, and then is adopted at the local level and filed with the state, ultimately leading to the last but very important implementation phase, which is what we're going to focus on today. Okay, and then in our third session, we talked about cost effectiveness in detail. As I noted earlier, if you folks, if everybody could mute yourselves, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Okay, so cost effectiveness. Cost effectiveness is required for energy code amendments, but it's also an important consideration for really any other policy option. Something's cost effective if over the life of your analysis, the value of the benefits exceeds
we got a
the
bunch.
cost.
Yeah, we're good.
We have somebody
Six or seven.
Misty, you need to unmute. Sorry, I hit mute all to solve our problem.
Oh, and you mute me.
It muted you
okay.
too, sorry.
That's okay. I kept resisting doing that. I wasn't sure. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the CEC leaves the methodology that you use up to the jurisdiction. That's your choice how you decide something is cost effective. But one of the things that's important to remember is that cost effectiveness and is different for different stakeholders. Everybody has different priorities. So you may need to adjust your conversation as you talk to different stakeholders. And lastly, I just want to remind you that the REACH Codes program produces cost effectiveness studies that are applicable throughout the state and that are available on the localenergycodes.com website. And the results are also available through our Cost Effectiveness Explorer, which is a tool that really simplifies working with the study results for your specific jurisdiction. It gives you a lot of tools to be able to translate those results into a meaningful policy. So as we've noted many times, it can be complicated, but there's a lot of help available, a lot of different organizations out here that are ready to assist, including your colleagues in other cities. Highly recommend you talk to your neighbors. Okay, and in our last session, we talked a little bit about the variety of the policy options available for local ordinances. In this current code cycle, most of the focus was on these first two options, our traditional REACH codes, like I was talking about earlier. And then on a natural gas moratorium, gas ban, or all electric requirement, they're phrased differently, but essentially all eliminate the use of natural gas in new construction primarily. There's a whole bunch of other policy options that are some are available, some are being developed right now. There's many different things that are being considered by many different jurisdictions. As you may know, CARB just passed their state plan for limiting emissions for appliances and the sale of appliances with NOx emissions. And then there's a couple other options too, where you could require appliance replacement on burnout or at time of sale. There's what we call a community scale phase out, or it's also been termed as end of flow, which is at a community scale, stopping the flow of gas. And also, there could also be some building emission standards. These are mostly under development. There are some example ordinances. In California, we've mostly used building performance standards based on energy metrics, but in other states, such as in New York, there's been a couple of jurisdictions that have adopted building performance standards based on emissions reductions. And so these are all different policy options that are, like I said, being considered. Some are available. There may be some legal enforceability questions for some of them. We're not quite sure. As I noted, the landscape is changing dramatically and quickly. And so this is something to keep an eye on as we move forward. Okay. So once you've gone through all the steps to design a REACH code, you've done all your outreach, you finally get it adopted, it feels like, woohoo, I'm done. But really, you're just done with the first phase. Implementation is really where the rubber meets the road in this process. This is what really yields the real implementation, is what yields the real impacts. It's what turns your policy from something that's a paper on a shelf to energy savings and greenhouse gas reductions. The real goal that we're looking for. Although there are several barriers, including time and resource constraints, that's one of the biggest ones. There's also many resources to help address these barriers and to minimize their impacts. And that's the focus of our session today, is how do we plan for that successful implementation? So that said, I'm going to hand everything off to Brian Reyes with Marin County to discuss a recent analysis that he conducted across the county. Brian?
Okay. Next slide, I guess. Hey everyone, Brian Reyes. I'm a sustainability planner with the County Marin, and just wanted to cover quickly our tracking the impact of our single family new construction and our energy reach codes, and if those worked. So next slide, please. Before we go there, I just wanted to let you all know the variety of green building codes that we see across our jurisdictions in Marin County. There's 12 of us. This is probably what you see across California as well. So in the top blue, we have our jurisdictions, and in the blue, we have County Marin, unincorporated Mill Valley and San Anselmo. And our current reach code status is Cal Green Tier 1 plus electric preferred. And the energy efficiency requirement for electric preferred is there is none for if you go all electric, and then we increase energy efficiency requirements as more gas fuel appliances are installed. Basically, you're incenting for electric and electric preferred. Then another tranche of the towns, Novato and San Rafael went Cal Green Tier 1, and they did the tiered energy efficiency requirement set forth by the state for 2019. And Tiburon and Fairfax, they also adopted Cal Green Tier 1, but then they excluded energy efficiency requirements. So they defaulted to base standards. Last tranche is the 5 down there in the gray had no reach code status nor additional energy efficiency requirements. So the point being here is that it drives builders crazy. Next slide, please. So now I'm honing in on the County Marin, that's who I work for, an unincorporated. And our reach code is currently at Cal Green Tier 1. That is, if you look to the left here, good is Title 24, better is Tier 1, and the best is Tier 2. So in the energy reach code we did, as I explained earlier, our electric preferred with enhanced energy efficiency requirements. And to dive down just a little deeper on that, there's 3 pathways to get there. All electric, no gas, limited mixed fuel, where basically you can only install gas cooking and or fireplaces only, and then mixed fuel, which is your standard gas and or electric appliances. Next slide, please. So with that, knowing what's sort of the background and the context of our county and what's going on, we wanted to assess early on how to understand the impact of this code, particularly electric preferred and those with a stronger energy efficiency requirements. So we dug into each building permit data, each permit application, and that was a pain in the butt. And we found that was not very comprehensive, and it lacked a lot of information, and I'm sure a lot of you ran into that. So to assess this, we dug into more, I guess, downstream from the permit process, where a project applicant in a building would submit their design plans and get it certified by the HERS assessors. So we want to assess our new construction energy reach codes, see if they were working as intended. And the 3 questions we asked was, are we seeing energy and greenhouse gas reductions and how they vary across jurisdictions? Are our codes being enforced? And how are building codes affecting change across the various code types that we saw across the county? Next slide, please. So our hypothesis we started with was more aggressive green building energy conservation requirements will result in more building energy and GHG savings. Next slide. And quickly, our methodology is that we only focus on single family residential new construction from the HERS providers, or those applicants they submitted database by CalCerts and Cheers. We process, visualize, and analyze the data, because that was important, using software, Power BI specifically. And then we use that to target interviews and do about a handful, 25 interviews with architects And then the limitations of the data is the metrics differed across code cycle years from 2016 to 2019. And an important point, and the last point, is projects sampled according to what was designed, not what was actually installed. Next slide, please. So our results and findings, one, we found that we wanted to see I'll reveal to you here the impact of our energy recodes across 2 code cycles, 2016 and 2019, and the impact of our electric preferred on energy and electrification reach codes. Next slide, please. So here's the first graphic. Here's the impact across code cycles, the light blue in 2016 and the dark blue in 2019. Basically what it is in 2019, of the 284 projects sampled, it's about 10 points and more energy efficient than in 2016. So yay, it works, but let's dig further in the data. Next slide. So we delineated that across all those different code types that I showed you earlier, and we found that first, the additional energy efficiency requirements of those of Calgary Tier 1 had a greater performance from 2016 to 2019. And the electric preferred, in which the county we had, plus Calgary and Tier 1, we had slightly better than code year, but that makes sense because we incentivized all electric, right? So we were not only going after energy savings, but also GHG savings. And then those that had no energy efficiency requirements perform pretty well compared to 2016, still above. And those with additional energy efficiency requirements, and then had Calgary and Tier 1 also perform better than 2016. Next slide. So to hone in on this, next slide, we want to dive into the 3 that we have, and these are compliance margins. So in 2019 specifically, across Mill Valley, San Anselmo, and County Marin, this is our margins against a base house. So we performed better of the 64 that we sampled. Next slide, please. Here's the upshot is we found that in the analysis, electric preferred reach codes are not driving all electric adoption in new construction in Marin. And so we could see in the table down there, we have first column, our electric preferred pathways, the number of projects sampled, and then our adoption rate. 67% of the 64 projects adopted mixed fuel. Our incentive didn't really work. So it was a good on-ramp, but it wasn't doing anything to actually move the needle over the last 3 years. So next slide, please. So our hypothesis was more aggressive green building energy efficient requirements reduce energy and GHG emissions. True, yes. Though the majority of the projects, about 2/3, still opted for gas installs. And remember I said that we use the data to hone in on the specific interviews of architects. We found in those interviews of the 25 that a lot of them were like, the only reason if those who went all electric, because the architect said, hey, you should do this, you know, and for whatever reasons they forced that onto their clients. And then one of the architect's quotes was, you know, 9 out of 10 of my clients just want gas cooking, and that's what it comes down to. Next slide, please. Another key finding is that the compliance documentation, as we went into building permits and we understood the data a little deeper, compliance documentation enforcement needs to be improved and streamlined. So found that some, and I'm sure all of you experienced, were not enforcing or documenting very well. That is building plan check, plan review, or inspectors. And it's not really their fault. It's this stuff is like a language. If it's not frequently happening, especially across small communities, it's like a language you don't remember or understand. So you need recurring training that's needed. Remember, these plan review and plan checkers and inspectors have a lot of things in buildings to look at. This is just another thing. In the HERS database that we got, did a lot of this analysis on, the data was delayed on installs as well as for design. So I'm did this analysis this 2021, late 2020, and it was dealing with 2019 data. And so it wasn't even complete and it was delayed. So the important is if you can get a good permit database, there's no delay. You can understand what the impact is now in the sort of relatively recent history. And then what we did to solve some of this is streamline our checklist, but we wanted to understand what the impact of GHGs and site energies was by appliances. So I created a checklist, and then we solicited our plan check and inspectors for feedback if this works, because they just wanted check boxes, right? So next slide, please. And this is what the checklist looks like. It's a table. We include it in our checklist. We have yet to launch it, but basically this is what, from what I understand, is what goes into the Title 24 calculator. Someone who's putting it in has all this information, but in the HERS database, you don't see this type of information. You kind of see a summary. So we include this in the checklist, and it should be an easy copy and paste over from whoever the green building specialist is. Next slide. And that's the conclusion. Thank you.
Alrighty. Thank you very much, Brian. There was a little bit of delay. I was still on mute. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and shift over to Lawrence Garber from the Building Decarbonization Coalition. Lawrence, would you like to display your own, or shall I keep going for you? I apologize.
Yeah, if you want to keep driving, that'd be great, Misty. Thanks.
Okay.
Appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Lawrence Garber. I'm the local government associate for the Building Decarbonization Coalition, and wanted to discuss with you all today some of the results that we gleaned from a survey that we put out in the late spring and early summer around building electrification ordinances at the local government level around the state. And some of our basic questions were, as the theme of this webinar today suggests, how is it going in terms of implementation? Can we get a better understanding of whether these policies are having their intended effects? And for staff such as yourself, what does the process look like, and how has that been going? So we partnered with Marin and Actera to help us out with this. So appreciations to Karen specifically, and then all the folks at Actera for helping us out with the survey this year. So next slide. So diving into a little bit more specifically what we asked, like I said, we're curious of how the implementation is going, and we did that across kind of two broad categories. One, by the numbers, so thinking about building permit results, whether or not those permits were all electric versus mixed fuel, and then we broke those down by the building types you see on the screen here: residential, single-family residential, and thus and also multifamily and commercial. And then the other piece here in terms of implementation, we asked some kind of more qualitative questions, such as how are you all able to track the data or not? Generally speaking, what challenges are jurisdiction staff reporting? And then also what success stories could we uplift? So I'm going to summarize in the next couple of slides the results that we got. So next slide. First, just at the top, who responded, wanted to highlight that here. 18 jurisdictions from around the state reported. So thanks to those of you who may be on the call today who took the time to fill out the survey. We appreciate it. And then just by ordinance type here, you can see on the right, the blue is the folks who reported that had an all-electric requirement as an ordinance in their jurisdiction versus all-electric preferred in the yellow versus a natural gas moratorium. So just wanted to offer the breakdown by ordinance of folks who responded. Next slide. And then to quickly compare that to the statewide picture, just to kind of get a brief look at, okay, of these 18 jurisdictions, how does this kind of compare, at least at the broadest level of the breakdown of the three policy options that are on the screen here. And you can see that it's pretty close. So we just wanted to kind of check that. Next slide. And then here I'll jump into some of the results of the total permits that were reported in the survey. And again, we were asking post-adoption, how many permits were reported to be all electric versus mixed fuel across the building types here. So just to orient ourselves on this graph, the y-axis is the number of total permits, and then the x-axis is broken down across single family, multifamily, and commercial. And the results here include all three ordinance approaches. So electric preferred is included in this analysis, all wrapped up. And I'll just caveat at the top that these results should not be seen as a representation of trends statewide. It's simply the results that we're able to glean. So not necessarily a representative sample, but you know, data and results nonetheless. So walking through it here. I'll also note on the bottom on the x-axis, while 18 jurisdictions reported in total to our survey, a smaller subset of those jurisdictions were actually able to report permit data. So note that in the x-axis, the number of jurisdictions reporting per building type is listed there as well. So with all of that set up, you can see, you know, looking at the bar graph, that about half of the single family residential permits were reported to be all electric, and that a little under half for multifamily. In addition, of the 5 jurisdictions that were able to report commercial permits, 1 of those permits was reported to be all electric. So you can see that in it's hard to see, but there's just like a little sliver of blue in that green bar graph, and that represents one permit there out of 44, I believe. So next slide. So you know what's going on here. I get there's a number of different reasons that can explain the fact that there were, you know, still some mixed fuel permits that were in jurisdictions that had either an electric preferred or an all electric ordinance. Firstly, in many cases, it was just too early for data, and many jurisdictions reported that they weren't able to respond, given that they maybe had only adopted a few months before that, or you know, if they were able to report permit data, they may just have had a handful of projects come through. So really early days still in terms of the data. And then, of course, there are a number of exemptions that specific jurisdictions had, and those varied across jurisdictions. But in terms of those who responded to the survey, folks reported that there were exemptions due to planning entitlements, ADU exemptions, so they were included as you know, they were reported as permits, but they were not all electric ADUs because, of course, there was, in that case, there were ADU exemptions. And then lastly, one of the jurisdictions that reported a number of permits, those were additions to an existing single-family residential, and thus they did not trigger the ordinance in that case. So a whole range of reasons why we're seeing, you know, those mixed fuel results. And again, just a caveat that the previous graph isn't intended to be looked at as like a statewide representative sample, simply a snapshot of what we were able to find. Next slide. So in addition to the numbers of you know, the building permit analysis, we also asked some more qualitative questions of how it's going for staff such as yourselves in terms of tracking the permit results. So one of the graphs I wanted to highlight here on the screen, you'll see we asked the question of what challenges does your jurisdiction face in terms of tracking. 16 folks were able to respond for us here. And you can see from the graph that over half didn't have a system to track how implementation was going. And a few jurisdictions reported that fields were not being completed, and only 1 jurisdiction reported no challenges. So hopefully this webinar, after you all have spent some time here today, you'll come up with some really key takeaways that you can bring back to your jurisdiction, so you can end up being in the green area of this pie chart, you know, in the coming months. Let's see here. Anything else I wanted to uplift on this graph? I don't think so. Next slide. And so I'll just close with a summary of kind of the general challenges and success stories that we pulled when we, you know, asked folks about this. Some of the challenges, which many of y'all may be familiar with, in terms of implementation, folks reported that PG&E lead times were a challenge for some of the projects. There were a few jurisdictions that reported in terms of the adoption. There was a slight CEC delay, and that was delaying their implementation. Additionally, some jurisdictions reported pushback from developers. Some reported a lack of staff to implement the ordinance. And lastly, as we've already talked about, some folks mentioned that they had no system in place to track the data. That being said, I've spent the last 5 minutes talking about challenges. There were some bright spots that folks reported. Several jurisdictions reported that they were not getting pushback from developers, and noted that the process for them was going pretty smoothly. And there was also another jurisdiction that uplifted. There were several large all-electric buildings that were under construction in their jurisdiction. So wanted to offer those results from the survey. And with that, I'll wrap it up and turn it back for Q&A, and happy to answer any questions that y'all might have.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Yeah, so we will open it up. If people have questions, you can put them in the chat or raise your hand at this point. And I will just kick things off with a question for Brian. Brian, would you mind sharing a little bit about how the findings of your study are informing Marin County's efforts going forward? Like how are you using what you found?
Yes, two ways. First, the conclusion of our electric preferred reach codes, which were most aggressive across our jurisdictions in Marin County. We're not incentivizing all electric wasn't really working, though the learned lesson was it helped on-ramp and get the conversation going. We would like to think that it influenced a lot of contractors knowing what's coming down the pipeline. But essentially we said, well, we got to compel something. So now during our model reach code development across the county, I've been recommending jurisdictions go all electric. If we all have in our climate action plans, aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goals, some as early as 0 by 2030, and with so anyway, so yeah, we just a lot of aggressiveness here in Marin County, and so where the rubber meets the road is this policy. So we've been able to use this information to say this is our evidence to compel all electric. And then the second part is in the implement, as indicated by Lawrence here, is we got to improve our tracking and data systems. That's the biggest challenge for us as unincorporated Marins in most other jurisdictions across our county.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I should mention we've heard from a couple other parts of the state, the Central Valley and Southern California, where the electric preferred seems to have a larger impact, so that it might vary a little depending on where people are located, and what's going on in their jurisdictions. So great to have that local information to be able to count on too. And then Lawrence, just wanted to ask you about what kind of the purposes behind the study, what you were hoping to glean from it, and what you thought the benefits would be of this tracking information that you were collecting there.
Yeah, our purpose for us was to really see if we could pull out some of these trends and then uplift those to jurisdiction staff such as yourselves, and really trying to understand what are some common pain points that we could then say, all right, folks, you're not alone in experiencing this, and there's a community of folks who may be experiencing similar challenges, and how can we then reflect that back to the greater community to say, actually, here's this pain point, but other folks might have been able to come up with some solutions. So really venues like this where we can have that dialogue back and forth, where just in giving jurisdiction staff something to react to, I think was one of the main goals.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. And then I'm seeing one question in the chat from Marissa asking if, Brian, if you have a paper summarizing the results. And you just replied, but why don't you say it for everybody?
I should have a 2-pager ready by November 7th that we can share thereafter.
Great. There's also another question in the chat, which is, so this is a question of how do you reconcile the all-electric requirement with the reality that the PG&E grid goes down when there are a few hot days across the Bay Area? So I think that's been a challenge with all-electric. Definitely, I think a lot of folks have heard concerns about all-electric with, either PSPS or other interruptions to the grid. And maybe Brian, this is more for you in terms of like, has this question come up in Marin County? How have you folks thought about addressed it? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure all of you in my my counterparts hear this a lot. Is the grid reliable, right? And it's not. I guess the big thing we talk about is it's not like everyone's going to pop onto the grid all electric all of a sudden, right? Because obviously the way we've been reconcile this, particularly with the constituents, and trying very hard, but it's hard for people to hear when there's a flex power, alert. But is like, look, this is a phasing, right? And these all electric codes are happening in phases. If the state itself is not saying all electric by this date, like it's us and jurisdictions doing it sort of piecemeal, which kind of sucks, but at the same time, it gives an opportunity for our grid to adapt, number one. Number two is in our service territory, our CCA is MCE, Clean Energy, and we've done a lot of engagement with PG&E. I mean, whether it's their 5, 10, 15, 20-year plans, they've all are, or even ISO statewide, they're all, their projections in the market is that the electrical load will increase. And so that's what they're planning for. I'm sure there'll be shutdowns, but yeah, so that's the way we reconcile. I don't have an easy answer, particularly for electeds. I wish someone had a good one-pager that we can say, hey, this explains it all. But yes, grid reliability is a big question.
Yeah, thanks. One last question for you, Lawrence, and then we're going to move on. But there's a question in the chat. Did the results that you received dig down into what was connected to gas? For example, was gas only run to cooktops?
Yeah, great question, Jay. We didn't get down to that level in what we asked of folks, but we do have on the back end that information of ordinances, for example, that exempted gas cooktops in single family, we didn't get any significant results that pointed to those cooktops being what was driving the mixed fuel approach, but it's something that I want to follow up on this exact question to maybe dig down for next year, because that's a good question. But mostly jurisdictions reported exemptions by other building types is what was driving the mixed fuel permits in our specific study group. So good question, Jay.
Great. So we are going to move on. There's one more question in the chat about tracking, and we are going to talk a little more about that, but please feel free if folks have responses or information about it to do that. But we're gonna talk just briefly a framework for implementation, some things for people to think about so we can get to our local government folks who are actually doing the work on the ground. So first thing, of course, the goals of implementation. Well, the main one, of course, as Misty said, is to just make sure that the purpose of the REACH code is realized, that you get those energy savings and greenhouse gas reductions that your jurisdiction was going for. And sort of secondary goals or under that, the process can help you to identify where there are problems and rough edges that need to be smoothed. And sometimes it can help you track successes and know what's been accomplished. And another benefit of the tracking is when you report it outward, like in a survey like the one that Lawrence just discussed, that can have wider benefits to help other jurisdictions and also help to shape regional and state actions and policies. So when you're thinking about implementation, there's really a surprising number of people that it's helpful to keep in mind. They all have different points of view, different abilities, different constraints. On the jurisdiction side, I used to work for local jurisdictions, and I'm always saying it's not just one entity. There's different staff. So you might have the sustainability staff who might have been very involved in developing an ordinance. Then you've got the planning staff who talk with project applicants usually pretty early in the process. And then the building department staff who are really the ones who are enforcing the REACH code when the plans are submitted. And they all have, different perspectives, different abilities, different points of view that it's good to consider. On the applicant side, there are property owners, developers, architects, all of these folks. And again, some of them, have very different perspectives on REACH code requirements and different abilities to respond to them and need different kinds of support. And then there are some other folks that it's good to keep in mind, not as directly involved, but elected officials will often keep an eye on a REACH code. Environmental organizations, the same. Manufacturers like to know when there's a REACH code going on and how it's going, since it can affect their supply, and could be others as well. So these are all just folks to keep in mind. So some of the things to think about in terms of implementation, outward facing resources, things that help to communicate your REACH code requirements to project applicants. What do applicants need to know? When do they need to know it? That's actually important. They really want to know it as soon as possible and not find out after they've designed a whole project that something is different, or that there's a different requirement that they weren't aware of. And what's the best way to communicate with them? What's a good format? So some common things, handouts, websites, summary sheets. And I did put in, since y'all will get the slide deck, these are links here to some cities and counties that have REACH code information on their websites, all in sort of different formats, different ways of presenting it, but they've got good ways of doing that. So that is are some examples that you all can take a look at. And then there are also some inward-facing resources. So it's also important to consider ways to support internal city staff, bearing in mind that different staff might need different assistance. So best thing to do is talk with folks to see what would be helpful for them. And then some options might be handouts like checklists that staff can use, or training, which could be a formal training session or just sitting down with a group of staff and a checklist and going over what the requirements are and talking it through. So these are just things to consider and think about. So with that very quick framework in mind, next we want to look at how implementation works in the real world. So we have a couple of folks here today who've really generously agreed to share their time and their experiences with us. Really want to thank both of them for participating and joining today. And each of them, I'm not going to introduce them, they'll introduce themselves and their city's REACH codes. And then we'll have a sort of more informal discussion of what each of the cities has done in terms of REACH code implementation. So first, I'm going to pass it to Christian Hoffland of the city of Santa Barbara. So, Christian.
Yeah, good afternoon. City of Santa Barbara, and we passed our amendment to our municipal codes as an ordinance last year in July, with an effective date of the 1st of this year. And so we had about 5 months, 4 to 5 months of prep time to get the word out and really help engage our outward-facing population and professionals, and then had about the last 9 to 10 months of continued implementation of that. So the first thing we did was really have an updated website, which had webinar recordings, links to the ordinance language, timelines, frequently asked questions, and really a kind of a one-stop shop for people to go to and find information about that. We did specific industry stakeholder outreach for some major groups that are really interested in wanting to know more about the process and the exemptions. So realtors associations, the local AIA group, builders and contractors were really the main ones we did specific outreach to. And then we did outreach to people within our planning and permitting process as well. They were very confused and concerned. So we had specific notification letters with flyers attached explaining to them if their project was already submitted and would not have to be under the ordinance, or if they were still in the design review process and their permits, when fully submitted, may be under the purview of the ordinance. So there was a lot of confusion around that. We wanted to make sure that we had good points of contact where people could call and really get the information very clearly out to those people who were very concerned. We did have kind of a one-pager takeaway forms for kind of key elements and key timeframes. And then we developed with our planning department an exemption process and application form to really clearly define what people were expected to submit in planning and permit review for getting any exemptions or for showing that their projects were not applicable to the ordinance. And with that said, kind of the last thing is we had one point of contact throughout that entire process where people could really come to and ask questions. So there was consistent messaging that was both for internal and external communication. So we really kind of had a consistent message there, one person everybody could go back to and ask questions, refine their questions, and get answers to those specific areas.
Great, that's a great introduction. Thank you, Christian. And then I'll pass it to Joe, the City of Burlingame. And you're on mute, Joe. Just need to.
How about that?
There you go.
Okay. Joe McCluskey, City of Burlingame Green Building Specialist. We're a much smaller city than Santa Monica. And so most of our outreach for the REACH codes came through the adoption process. We had stakeholder meeting with architects, designers, developers, and then the city council had a study session before one of the council meetings. That all goes on the Legistar system, so people knew to come in and listen to that or talk at that. And then it took a couple of tries through the council. It went back and forth, so there were several meetings there. Adopted in 2020 and then took effect 10/16/2020. Anything that was in process at that point was already didn't fall under the REACH code, so it took probably 6 or 8 months before we really got a lot of projects coming in. Initially, it was a lot of work going back and forth with the architects, explaining everything to them directly. I'm basically the single point of contact, and a lot of the people here know me because I've been around for a while. So when they had questions, they'd just email me or call me, and we'd go over it and try to figure out what they're asking or what they were looking at. We do have a pretty good website under the building and under the sustainability part of the website. There's information. We send out stuff in the city email blast that goes out once a week. And so then for Burlingame, it's been basically only single family homes. We do have other parts for commercial and multifamily, but we haven't had any projects that have been issued under those. We've had a lot of discussions with big new buildings, big labs, millions of square feet going out by the bay, but none of those have actually submitted and been reviewed and issued. Most of the single family homes choose gas for a cooktop, and the architects and homeowners all want gas for cooking. Some of the ones that have gas for cooking also then choose gas for fireplaces or fire pits or something. I've only seen one where there was only a fire pit, but not gas for cooking. With our next round of reach codes, which have already started, we are going to eliminate the exceptions for cooking and for fireplaces. It seems like that will go forward, which would start in December. And then the challenge is to keep track of which code each project is under, in terms of knowing which parts apply to which one. For the submissions, I do a Cal Green and a reach code review separately. And I look at we have a reach code checklist, which we got from a template from Bayren. We require the applicants to fill that out and put it on their plans. And then they have the energy report, which specifies the appliances and a fair amount of the parts that are part of the reach codes, the water heater, space heater, things like that. And then the plans themselves. So my role is to cross-check them and make sure they're the same. Because sometimes the reach code checklist will say all electric, but the Title 24 report will say gas water heater. Or the Title 24 will say heat pump, but the plans will show an air conditioner and an FAU somewhere in the attic. So I go through the plans and the Title 24 and try to make sure that everything matches. In terms of outreach internally to the inspectors, they basically just come talk to me about stuff directly. And my approach has been to put specific notes on the plans everywhere that something is required. So where the cooktop needs to have electrification, I say it needs a 50 amp circuit, and I make the architect put it on the plans, not just as a note, but right next to the cooktop. Next to the washer dryer, say no gas for the dryer. Fireplaces say you need a separate electrical circuit for the fireplace. So everything gets its own note. For the car chargers in the garage, we say it needs a level 2, this many amps, this many volts, and put it actually on the floor plan. I tried pretty hard to get them not to put the notes buried in a bunch of other notes or with a cross-reference, to try to put it on the electrical plan and on the floor plan, so that people in the field, when they're flipping through the plans, can actually just see right there in the middle of the living room, it says I need a receptacle for the fireplace. In terms of implementation, it's up to the inspectors at that point in the field to make sure that what's put in matches the plans. When the projects are complete, I don't go in the field to look at any of the things. What I do is I look at the HERS report, the CF1R project status report under CalCerts or Cheers, and the inspector may say this is done in terms of a building department, the structure, and I will go back to the builder and say, look, your CalCerts is not done. Look, you got some red dots instead of all green dots, or it doesn't say complete. Download it and send it to them and say, here's what you have to do to complete this. And so it's not exactly checking the reach codes, but getting the energy documentation dialed in is pretty important. Once they're done with that, I attach that to their permit, and then I sign off on the reach code.
Great, great. So we're going to dive into a couple of these things a little more, and just want to kind of, focus on first the outward facing and then maybe the inward facing. So starting with Christian, I think you mentioned your stakeholder engagement process and some documents that you prepared as part of that. But what have you done in terms of communicating outward, communicating with the applicants and other outward stakeholders in Santa Barbara?
Yeah, like I said, we had a series of webinars that we went directly to different stakeholder groups. And then we had general webinars posted on our website as well. We also have a city newsletter that announcements were made and linked back to our website with that information. And then we had the contact information there as well. So we did get quite a few requests for information on exemptions and kind of process through different stakeholders. You know, surprisingly, permit expediters were really interested in the process and the exemptions, which I wasn't expecting. Not so much from property owners, but more from really design teams. And as we received more and more questions, you know, we put those into our FAQ section. So those were right there for people to be able to see and provide that clarity to everyone. And you know, the people within the permit process who had already started a design review process, which can be quite lengthy here at times, really wanted to make sure that they were fully aware of what requirements were coming and what the timelines were.
Yeah. Yeah. And Joe, how about in Burlingame? What have you done for the project applicants, or how have you communicated with those so that they know really what's expected in terms of the REACH code?
Well, a lot of them just would either email me or call me, say, hey, can I have a backup generator? And I'll say, well, let's look at the REACH code. What does it say? No gas except for this or that. So no, sorry, you can't have it. And then they'll say, oh, well, isn't this better, you know, to have gas rather than, you know, electrical? And say, well, here's what it says. So we kind of go back to the code and then say, here's where we are. And then a lot of the rest of the training happens during comments. So they submit their plans and I'll provide comments, say you have to add this, that, or the other thing. Sometimes they make forward progress on one round, but slide backward on something different. Just have to keep after them and teach them the REACH codes basically through the review process.
Yeah.
And again, we're pretty small, so there's not dozens or hundreds of different designers or applicants. There's just a few.
Right. Right. So then switching to the internal in support for staff, and Joe, you mentioned you know, really working with your building inspectors and the other you know, folks on the other folks on your side. What have you done internally to implement the REACH code, including training, implementation, things for staff to make sure that all the staff are on board?
Well, Marin has this nice thing where they'll come over and do a training at your apartment. So early on, I think even before we adopted, I had them come and do a staff training during one of our building department meetings on the REACH codes. So, and then after that, they all knew to come to me. Talked with them about like, what's the best way to do this? We're kind of transitioning between paper and all electronic. So originally when this started, I had a big red stamp built up that said 2020 REACH codes apply. And one of the inspectors said, could you just put this near the front? After talking with them, I tried to get a lot of the information put on the cover page of the plans. I take the special features and the required features from the energy code and put that on the cover page.
Yeah. Okay, great. And Christian, on your internal side, have you? Your REACH code is a little newer, so I'm not sure how far you've gone down this road, but I think you've done some work on this. So how has Santa Barbara been addressing the internal side?
Yeah, no, it was really great. We had a training again with our building department inspectors and plan reviewers, and also our planning department, and brought them all in together and gave them a kind of a more detailed presentation on the ordinance language and then the process as well, which was really important. And had some really great questions from them. Like any code or ordinance, there's always going to be something in a gray area where it's not perfectly described in the code. And so we have a process for those types of projects of how they'll go through, or for the exemption process. And so we had some really great questions come out of that, and then kind of introduced myself as the point of contact for kind of everything with that ordinance. So we've had several of them come back to us with specific projects of how do you see this project and what's the interpretation here? And then we work together collaboratively to come up with a solution for that. So everybody's on the same page. And then moving forward, everybody knows the answer.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds both of you have the single point of contact, and so everybody in your jurisdictions, both internal and external, know who to call, and that sounds like that's a really, really useful thing. We do have a question in the chat asking specifically for Joe, but I'll also ask for Christian, that you noted your reach codes for all new residential project, and what about remodels? So in both of your jurisdiction, how does your code relate to remodels, renovations at all, or how's that work?
So always difficult to decide if it's a new house or not. It's something that's already part of the building code in general. You know, if you have a 2,000 square foot house and you tear down 1,800 square feet and rebuild it, that's new. But if you do something marginal, then who knows? The one project that I always remember was they had 74 feet 3 inches of exterior wall they were keeping, and 74 feet of exterior wall that they were going to remove. And from a planning definition, that's less than 50%, so it's not a new house. However, it was a house where they were keeping 800 square feet and adding 1,200 square feet. To me, 1,200 is bigger than 800. It's clearly a new house. Our metric is based on valuation. So it's the value of the new house versus the value of which parts you kept. And our council was a little uncomfortable with that. So they also specified that they would have to be replacing the HVAC system. They were concerned that someone would do a very, very fancy kitchen and that we would then call it a new house. It really doesn't come that close where we're splitting hairs like that. When something comes to the city, it starts, if it's going to be a new house or a new development, it's going to start with the planning department with design review. And at that point, the CBO does a review and he'll specify this is a new house and you have to comply with the reach codes. So then when it gets to me and they don't have the reach codes, I go back into the software and take the note out from his letter that they've gotten and say, look, comment number 4 from Rick Caro says this is going to be reach codes. You're supposed to do this as a new house. So no gas for space heating, space cooling, water heating, or clothes drying. So please redesign. And then I give them the comments about what that means.
Yeah. Christian, how is it similar in Santa Barbara, or how have you addressed the question of remodels? Does your code have specific guidance on that?
Yeah, no, it does. And it was, there's 2 main points of discussion at our city council, which is the exemptions and the applicability to kind of remodels, build backs, substantial improvement, name it whatever you want to. And the final decision was to choose to align with current planning and building codes. So the applicability cutoff for kind of a major demolition rebuild is at 75% of 2 of the following: your structural roof, structural exterior walls, structural foundation or foundation members. And so that was done for 2 things. One is really to align with the current system and current language. And the second one is to really capture kind of like major demolition and rebuilds. The intent of the ordinance, and it's written into the ordinance, is to come back and revisit the ordinance every few years to see if those thresholds are correct or if they need revising, both with the exemptions and the applicability. So that's really kind of the current thinking and the best effort that the city had. And we had to make a lot of clarifications around ADUs as well. Fully separate building new ADUs on a property, it would be applicable, but if you're doing an addition onto a property, it's not. So, there are some nuances there. There's some houses we have there 1,000 square feet. People put a 3,000 square feet addition onto it. They're not demolishing, demoing the existing building. It's not considered new construction in the ordinance. So there definitely are some nuances there of, maybe potentially things we could capture in the future if we wanted to and felt were necessary, or changing that 75% to 50% potentially. There's certainly been already 1 or 2 applications where they're at 74.5%, and it's clear that the architect made a very concerted effort to come in right under that. And I guess with any code or ordinance, you're always going to have maybe 1 or 2 that do that. But yeah.
Yeah. So one other question, you mentioned a couple times exemptions, and I think, Christian, you said that you had developed an entire exemption process for the city. Can you expand a little more on just what the discussion has been around exemptions, what some of the issues you've encountered, and where you've ended up with it?
Yeah, that was, a big part of our outreach and discussion in the process of adopting the ordinance was going over exemption lists and different stakeholder groups, really giving their opinions on that, looking at industry research and the science and technology behind that. And so we ended up with basically 3 exemptions: cooking appliances and commercial kitchens, because the industry just isn't there yet for all the pieces of equipment in a commercial kitchen to be electrified economically. There are a lot that are, and we considered creating just a list of the ones that were not economical, but knowing that list would have to be revised every 3 to 6 months was not something we had the capability to do at this time. So we just went ahead and exempted all of them. Laboratories and clean rooms in medical buildings, we heard some feedback that there's some potential there, and didn't want to limit that, as we do have a decent amount of medical facilities here. And then we also added a very interesting one, which is when in the public interest or infeasible. And so it's kind of a catch-all for those things that we cannot foresee, feasibly foresee of what impact that might have. So there is a possibility for people to apply under that. In our FAQs, we made it very clear some of the common things that would not be able to be allowed to be applied for in that section, such as spas, grills, outdoor fire pits, indoor fireplaces, things that people commonly want, but that would not be considered an infeasibility or in the public interest to be able to apply for those, to try to limit the amount of applications that our building department has to process for those. And so, so that process just clearly delineates kind of like what kind of information we expect the applicants to bring when they are applying for those. Most of them are pretty obvious. If it's cooking appliances in commercial kitchens, that's just checking a box on the application. But when it's in the public interest or infeasibility, we really ask for them to give a full explanation of their research of existing options for the piece of equipment that they're asking for an exemption for, and really put the onus of them doing their research and proving their case on the applicant's side, so then it isn't put back to the building permit official side.
Great. And Joe, I don't know if you want to add any more to that. I think you also mentioned that the city was planning to change some of its exemptions going forward, right, for residential.
It looks like we will adopt with no exceptions for cooking or for fireplaces or fire pits. We still have an exception for commercial kitchens. So that'd be, someone that's cooking things to sell to grocery stores or something like that, and for-profit restaurants. But since the ordinance is based on new construction, we haven't really run into anybody that's going to build an entire new restaurant or anything like that. Anything that's replacing a tenant improvement of an existing restaurant would just use the existing infrastructure. So it hasn't really come up. The only time is if they're doing a large development and they want to do like a labs or some kind of a startup, then typically some of those places have kitchens. Like if you were a Facebook or a Google or somebody like that, that's not allowed because it's not a for-profit kitchen. But we haven't actually had anybody propose any of those yet. We've discussed it with a few applicants, but it hasn't come up.
Yeah. Question in the chat, I think following up on this, what about portable outdoor barbecues and fire pits? I think maybe propane fired or wood fired is what they're thinking of. Are there any?
Not addressed by the ordinance.
Yeah, not addressed by building code, to my knowledge, that, you know, somebody could put one of those in their back patio, so.
Right. Looks like Brian has a question. Brian, do you want to just ask that?
Oh, no, I was going to comment on that portable outdoor barbecue pit. Sorry, and to confirm, is this for new construction?
Right.
Yeah, and so in our model reach code, we did put in an exemption for portable barbecue outdoor fire pits. It's just such a small amount, and if we're going to get pushback, the risk of getting that pushback, considering the overall good that we were trying to do in other sections, we didn't feel was worthwhile at this point. But remember, you can always update the codes, as we always do frequently, and that may not be exemption in the future.
Right. All right, so we should wrap this part up. Just one last question for both of you, which is, you know, based on your experiences with implementing your reach code so far, do you have any words of advice for folks who are starting down this road, maybe adopting their first reach code right now and just getting into this? We'll be getting into this implementation phase, you know, very soon in terms of implementation. So maybe Christian, start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good question. I think one is taking public feedback with a grain of salt. There's always going to be people that are opposed to any change, but really being transparent and open to listen to all stakeholders and their opinions, as you really get informed a lot of where, you know, it can inform not only your code, but it can inform your outreach and education efforts as well, is really kind of where you need to focus, or what, you know, studies you need to reference to explain what current technology is, or what the benefits are, or what other jurisdictions have already done, and how the impact has been had there. So that would be my main takeaway.
Yeah, thank you. And Joe?
So what I'm going to say is you're going to design your reach codes, and you're going to try to guess what's going to happen and figure out all the different possibilities. And then as soon as you adopt them, you're going to come up against all kinds of situations that you never imagined. And you just kind of have to roll with the punches and try to figure it out. When I started, I tried some comments on my reviews, and then after a while I didn't like them and I tried different ones. So you're not gonna set something in stone and have it fit perfectly. You kind of have to learn as you go and be flexible.
Yeah, great words of advice. Thank you. And thank you both so much for joining us this morning and sharing all your experience and knowledge with the group. That's really helpful. So we only have 9 minutes left, so I'm going to pass it back to Misty, who's going to take us through some resources and then wrap things up.
Indeed. Thank you, Karen. And thank you to the panelists. That was absolutely fabulous. Some great information there. Thank you. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, fabulous. Alrighty, so now that we have talked a little bit about the goals of implementation, who's involved, the different approaches you can take, you've heard from folks with real world implementation experiences and the things that surprised them, that they planned for and didn't plan for. We want to just talk a little bit about some resources that are available to help you with implementation as you start down that same road. Okay, so we actually talked with several jurisdictions at the beginning of the cycle, once many jurisdictions had adopted, and asked about a whole bunch of different resources. And what we found out is that one of the most valuable things is actually checklists and summaries of the actual ordinance. These can actually be used to communicate with permit applicants as well as for internal reference throughout the entire process as somebody applies for a permit and then as they work their way through. You can use these to communicate the requirements and help people reference that. We have actually put together some generic checklists. We will be updating those now for the next code cycle, but they are meant for you to customize. As you can see on the slide, there's no logo. There's just kind of a place for a logo. These were actually modeled after the Marin County checklist, the original source there. We have several of these, and again, we encourage you to download them, to use them, to change them to suit your needs, and to make them yours, essentially. Make them work for you. There's a link at the bottom of the slide here to the templates. We've got them posted online, so you can go ahead and grab them for your own use. In addition, you heard all of our panelists actually talk about training and about communicating with internal staff and how important that really is. We have developed it's kind of a generic training slide deck. Joe mentioned that Bayren will come and present the training to your department. In addition, you can download the slide deck and use that yourself if you like. So there are pieces of it that you may want to present to your department if there's a particular item. It can be customized or it can be provided as a resource as well. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. Do talk with staff about the training options available. Most of the time, it makes sense to train for the REACH code in conjunction with your training for the energy code. They work together, and often the REACH code is actually enforced and implemented during that energy code review. So it makes sense to do that. And basically, there are many different classes available, some specifically geared towards REACH codes, others that are not, but they range from very informal to full day long formal courses. So I strongly encourage you to take advantage of that and to notify your staff of what's available there. And last but not least, don't forget new folks that come on board. They'll also need to know what's going on. Tools for tracking. This is actually going to depend on your jurisdiction, what tools you have available. It's going to depend on the type of system, the permit tracking system that your jurisdiction uses, how you track projects as they move through the process now, and whether or not you may have an ability to make some minor modifications to the existing tracking system that can help you identify those projects. It may be that you get an electronic equivalent of Joe's big red stamp. That helps. There's all kinds of ways that you can do this. You can use it through the project files, spreadsheet tracking, depending, again, on the size of your jurisdiction, the volume of projects that go through your building department, the existing tracking systems, and the resources you have available. So it really is something that you need to customize for your jurisdiction, and it's going to depend, again, on the resources that you have available. Highly encourage you to think about this before your implementation date, though. It will make your life much easier. Okay, just the last couple of minutes, we have a couple of key items from our talk today that I'd like to just quickly review. As far as staff time, you do need a designated champion for ongoing implementation, such as Christian and/or Joe. They help everybody get through the process, both internal and external. That will make the REACH code process much smoother and make it a much easier lift for everybody. You do need to consider that there will be some time for the building department staff, as well as if you have a champion, the sustainability staff or planning staff, wherever that person resides. It will take a little bit of time to implement the code. It's that amount of time is going to depend on your ordinance and how complex it is. For something like an all-electric, there are issues that come up, but it's also a fairly straightforward, limited set of requirements. How you implement them is not entirely straightforward all the time. I'm not meaning to imply that. Communication. Communication, I think, is one of the biggest keys here. Communicate with applicants, especially early in the process. People do not like surprises. Surprises can be very expensive and very inconvenient. So make sure that you communicate the requirements as soon as you interact with applicants, and also with staff. Staff needs to understand exactly what the requirements are, what the process is when they have questions. Typically, that's the same kind of processes as your building department already has in place, but they need to understand how that works and how they get their questions answered, and what to do when they encounter a challenge. And lastly, tracking. We just talked a little bit about tracking and the options available. Try to consider what it is you're going to want to understand about the ordinance and about the impacts. How do you want to document that in a couple of years? What will you be able to report out? And what do you want to be able to report out? If you think you're going to start from there and work backwards, it really helps on what kinds of things you need to track. Do try to set up systems for collecting the data if at all possible. Again, like I said, that's going to depend on your jurisdiction and what resources you have available. But if you can do that prior to implementation, it will help a lot. And then monitor and adjust. Don't be afraid to refine things as you go forward. As both of our panelists mentioned here, there's going to be things you did not think about. It's just the case with really any policy. So don't be afraid and report those achievements out. It really is helpful for others to find out exactly what kind of impacts you're seeing. Okay. And it's 11:30, so we really don't have too much time for questions, but I do want to thank all of our panelists, and I want to thank all of our attendees. Thank you all for coming to this session and to our other sessions. This has just been a pleasure to run, and a pleasure to hear all of the experiences and challenges and lessons learned from everybody. Really, really appreciate it. We have some other resources and contact information that'll be in the presentation for you. I'm not going to go through them now because I don't want to keep your time. But I know I can stay on a couple of minutes if folks would like to. I'm not sure if our other panelists are available maybe for another 5 minutes or so. I see one yes. Okay, great. Thank you, Christian. But officially, I think we'll wrap things up. Thank you again to everybody. I appreciate it.